All right. Welcome everyone to the second summer session this year from California's Advancing Civic Education, also known as CACE. For those of you who were not with us last summer session, the goal of these summer sessions is to jumpstart the We the People program for this year to give you some critical background information, context, and tips and tricks for how to be successful in this program going forward. And before we go ahead and get started with this program summer sessions agenda, I'm going to give all of the volunteers who are here an opportunity to introduce themselves for those who weren't on the summer session last time, or for the students that weren't on the summer session last time. So I was there last time, but as a reminder, my name is Sabrina McGraw. I am the president of CASE. I am a attorney. I work for the California Department of Justice as a Deputy Attorney General. I have this sick badge as evidence of that. And I am an alum of the program from 2013. I was in Unit 5, but have been volunteering for basically since I graduated from the program. And I'm really passionate about this program, love it. You might see occasionally my dog Citra in the background. She's also very passionate about civic education. You can kind of see her head right there. So, Katie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Katie Keeshan. I am an environmental educator working in the San Francisco Bay Area. So not a lawyer. There's lots of different ways to get involved in your community too. I do have a background in government. I used to work in the California State Assembly, which was a whole wild time in my life, and then I became a park ranger, now an environmental educator. I'm a 2016 alum. I was in Unit 6, and I've been volunteering with CASE since 2018, I think. So I've been around the block. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today, and I am going to popcorn to Ria.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ria Shroff. I've been with the program since 2015. I was a Unit 2 person back then. Been volunteering ever since. The pandemic made it a lot easier. Now I'm a biomedical engineer and product designer at a small medical device startup. And yeah, excited to work with you guys this year. I'll popcorn to Sean.
Good morning. My name's Sean Gentry. I'm an alum of the program from 2002. And I was Unit 1 back in the day, which you'll learn more about today when we do our presentation. Currently, I am an employment attorney. I right now represent mostly higher education institutions and employment matters. Um, and I've been doing that for about 15 or 16 years. Has Rishab gone? Let's go to Rishab.
Sure, yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Rashab. I was in the last case session where I objectively proved that the judiciary is the strongest branch. And I used my knowledge from being on Amador's Unit 4 from 2020. And I've been volunteering with CASE for a while. And right now I'm not an attorney, but a paralegal at a small law firm that does like family law. And I also tutored the LSAT on the side. But this is my real passion, doing civic education here. And I'll pass off to Harsha.
Hi, I'm Harsha Madalyar. I'm from Foothill High School, class of 2019, also Unit 1. Right now, I am a policy advisor to the Democratic Commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission in DC, and I'm also a night student at Georgetown Law School. I'll pass to Joshua.
Hi everyone, I am a alum from last year's Foothill team for 2025, and I am an alum of Unit 1. I'm currently an incoming freshman to Harvey Mudd College, where I plan on double majoring in physics and political science. This is obviously my first year volunteering at CASE, but I hope there are many more years ahead of me. I think that is all the volunteers.
All right. Thanks, everyone. So now we're going to dive straight into the agenda. And the first thing on the agenda is just a quick recap on how a hearing works. So that's what we talked about last week, or 2 weeks ago. But as a reminder, the way that the We the People program is set up is somewhat like a mock congressional hearing where the students are experts on the Constitution and educating the judges, who are kind of like Congress people, about the Constitution and questions. And that is sort of the setup. And so typically you'll have a 4-minute testimony prepared, an opening statement that answers a set of 3 questions. Usually it's an overarching question and 2 sub-questions. And after you have stated your prepared remarks, everyone puts all of the notes away, and then the judges will proceed to ask you questions for the next 8 minutes or so. And then after that, the judges will give you feedback, and that is generally how a hearing is set up. Now, that's a very simplified version of what that actually looks like. But in reality, there's a lot that goes into the prep, not just for the opening statement, but also for getting you up to speed and ready to deliver really concrete and thorough answers to the questions in the question and answer period. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that all today. In particular, we're going to focus on opening statement and evidence as we go forward. So I'm going to first pull up the score sheet. Now, last session, we talked about the score sheet breakdown specifically on the categories related to analysis and understanding, discussion, and application. Now, this session, I'm going to briefly talk about the remaining 2 categories in the rubric, which is opening statement and evidence. So I'm going to share my screen right now to show you what that looks like. All right, so this is the rubric as we had looked at last session. And this is the rubric that judges will be using in scoring your competitions. And these are the 2 remaining categories. So as I mentioned last time, you get whole score numbers in between 0 and 10 for each category. So the opening statement is the first category. And notice that the opening statement is its own category. That means that everything you say in your 4-minute testimony and how you deliver the information, how you answer the question, is going to be captured only in this rubric item. So the other categories, although you're talking about evidence, although you're doing analysis and understanding, and you're applying the Constitution in your testimony, it is not going to be reflected in any other category except the opening statement category. So that's just really important to remember. In the opening statement, the main ideas that judges will be looking for is that the opening statement answers all elements of the question. This is extremely important. Oftentimes, students think, oh, the question sort of gives the theme, and as long as you're sort of responding to the theme, you are going forward. But what's actually really critical is that most judges will have a list of all of the questions, and they will do a check mark as you answer each of the questions and take notes on how you answer each of those questions. You will lose points if you do not answer all of the questions. So it's really critical that you do the same kind of check mark, especially as you're iterating and going through answering and doing different drafts of your opening statement, that you are not losing sight of answering each question and every part of the question. It's really important. I oftentimes will get feedback that says, yeah, that testimony was great. Unfortunately, didn't answer the question. That's really critical. The other component here is all students participated in the presentation of the opening statement. This is really easy points. Just make sure you divide evenly amongst yourselves, as each person will have usually a paragraph or a couple of sections, a couple sentences as you go spread out. And lastly, and I think this is the other part that's important, is students have taken a well-organized and logical approach to their statements using appropriate and accurate references to the Constitution, scholarly sources, relevant cases, legal opinions, historical documents, and other materials to substantiate their claims. This is kind of what I was saying earlier, is you have to have all of the other elements of the rubric in your opening statement too. And this is the part that is where the points come through for the opening statement. So you have to have evidence to substantiate your claims and your answers in the testimony. Now, one thing I think students really need to pay attention to is this is not an essay that you're writing in class. This is a speech that is going to be solely heard by the judges. Judges do not get copies of your testimony ahead of time or ever. And so they have to solely judge you based off of what they hear. And that means making sure that your testimony is easy to listen to. That's going to be critical for signposting, making sure you say first, second, third, finally, guiding the listener to all the different components of your section. Also, restating parts of the question in your answers so that the judges know that you're hitting all elements of the question. Sometimes people take really nuanced approaches to the question. That's okay, as long as the judge knows that that's what you're doing to answer the question. And you do that by restating parts of the question in your answer. And overall, I think people just need to, you students need to practice saying your speech over and over again out loud, not only to get used to being able to deliver it correctly, but also to make sure that it's something that's easy to listen to. And in particular, I think people like to include really big words in their testimony to make it sound kind of artful and beautiful, like they might do in a essay where they're showing off their vocabulary. But here, that shouldn't be the focus. You should be accurate and precise, but also to the extent you can, concise, because that's going to make it easier to listen to. Next, is there any questions before I move on to the next category, or do any of our volunteers want to chime in?
I was just going to add something. I think um, everything that Sabrina described was like how you meet the expectations of an opening statement. And I think going beyond that, what makes some teams stand out more than others is like, do you have interesting answers to the questions that are being presented to you? Because I think there are often ways that you can like obviously answer the question, like really major historical events or like the constitutional rights that we talk about most often might be the things that come to mind first to answer the question. But I think going beyond that and adding either like unique examples or like answers that may not be the first thing that comes into your mind really helps set your team apart from the others in how you answer the questions for your opening statement.
Harsha actually took a lot of what I was going to say, but another thing that really sets you apart is how you format your answer. So obviously you can say it in a pretty basic speech-esque like format or tone, but a lot of things like using things like anecdotes or using things that like compare what you're saying to a more like easy to understand thing. Like what my unit did a lot last year was set out an anecdote that related what we were talking about to something that was like completely unrelated. Like I remember my team used an example of like Jordans to compare like how popular something was. Just something that is not necessarily related in like the purest like civic sense, but something that can grab the judge's attention. Because during a competition, they're going to be listening to so many different testimonies that you want yours to stand out. So yeah.
So I would add one more thing, which is make sure you state the obvious when there is an obvious answer to a question in your testimony. A lot of times students really want to show the breadth of their knowledge or how educated they are on a certain legal issue or philosopher issue, and they go down a rabbit hole into something that's very interesting, but they forget that there may be a very clear, direct answer to the question that every other school is going to say. And so if you avoid or if you get too creative and forget to give the judges the things that they're looking for, you're going to be docked for that because the judges can't say, "Oh, you definitely knew what judicial review was in this question about, judicial review or whatever the topic is."
And I just wanted to add, there's a discussion in the chat, but just for the recording people listening at home or those who can't see the chat because they're on their phone, there was a question about whether or not you should be aiming for a certain time within the 4 minutes for testimony. I think the question got deleted, but the goal is that you should basically get as close to 4 minutes as possible without going over, but to be safe as Josh had commented, shooting for around 3 minutes and 50 seconds is a good estimate there. If you go over 4 minutes, you won't be able to. In a competition, you will be cut off and you will not be able to even, if you're halfway through a word, you won't even be able to finish beyond the 4 minute mark. And so it's really important to try and just do it within the 4 minute time period. You will not get more points if you spend less time on your testimony. And as Sean mentioned in the chat, if you're significantly under time, it's not that you're going to be like punished for being under time itself, but it means you're likely not answering all parts of the question completely. So that 4 minute testimony is really intentionally designed to get you to fully and completely answer the question.
Similarly, you won't lose points for getting cut off directly, but you've probably missed something in your prepared statement if you're finding yourself getting cut off. Or it might, oh, Sean's added no in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, it might just show that you've not finished your thought to us.
That's right. Any other questions about testimony writing for now? Or
I guess just to
go ahead.
be very direct, there's no score for the time itself. It's just what that means about the completeness of your testimony.
Okay, now moving on to the other component of the rubric, evidence. We're going to be talking a lot more about evidence in a little bit, but as a high level on the rubric, evidence is the bread and butter of this program and of the question and answer period. This is going to be the thing that is most challenging to master at the very start of the program because it requires a lot of learning on your part and a lot of research to get a sense of everything that is out there. But as you go through this program, you will build your knowledge base, build your evidence base, and it will get a lot easier where you can then focus a lot more on the other components of this program. So for evidence, judges will be looking for accurate references to the constitutional texts, principles, and other relevant primary, secondary support sources to support their arguments. You're going to be wanting to not only say the facts that you learned, but the source that you found them. Every court case, you should say the first name versus the last name and the year. It's going to be hard, but the year is important, not just to show that you know the year, but also because the year provides important context to the judge about when this happened in history and can make sure that it's accurately reflecting the answer to the question, which oftentimes will be a question about the time period. You'll often get questions like, at the time of the founding, what was this issue looking like? Versus in contemporary times, how was this issue handled? And so it's really important that your answers reflect the correct time period. And so having the time there is important. Also, just more generally, aside from cases, citing your sources to show that your knowledge is actually based off of something that is reliable and important. We'll talk about how you can get that a little bit in a little bit. But also here is students have referenced historical events or influential figures to demonstrate contextual understanding of the question. A little bit what I was saying before, but sources and evidence doesn't just have to be a court case. It doesn't have to be a statistic, but it can also be talking about different historians' takes or talking about different philosophers' understandings. All of that is going to be in the scope of evidence. Anytime you're relying on anything to answer the question. And the last key here is students have provided historical or current day examples or case studies that illustrate the real world impact of the Constitution or constitutional principles. So again, I think this is the kind of evidence that's comes a little bit later, but it is talking about things that actually apply the principles and ideas you're talking about. So it's not just statistic, but like showing in the real world what happened. I remember during my year in 2013, there was a Fourth Amendment question, and we were talking about drug sniffing dogs and whether or not they violated students' rights if they were being used in the high school parking lot. And we were talking about that, and I was able to use evidence in real world application by talking about those drug sniffing dogs being on my campus at the time and how that impacted students. And so those are sometimes good pieces of evidence using real world application. I'm going to actually turn this over now to Ria, who's going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on evidence, and then we can have more folks chime in on evidence and ask questions. But feel free to start sending your questions in the chat or raising your hand too as we proceed. Ria, do you want me to share my screen for you?
Sure, if you don't mind, just that one pager of what the evidence types we are talking about. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so I'll be going into the types of evidence. I think this is a part that a strong unit is going to get locked down very early in the year. You're going to start really knowing what sorts of evidence you want to pull from, and then the analysis starts to really develop as the year goes on, where the evidence kind of becomes that kind of just a reflex that you have. If you get both early on, you're doing a great job. So today we're going to talk about the 7 main categories that you might pull from for evidence. So starting with philosophy, this is a specific reference to the philosopher's text, their influence on maybe how they influenced the founding fathers in creating our government or their actions in life. So here you not only you can not only tell us just, oh, Locke was a natural rights guy, but you might tell us the exact 2 treatises on government. You might tell us the exact wording of what he said. That that's a philosopher you're probably going to read about. If you haven't already, you'll probably cite him. You're probably going to cite the basic guys: Montesquieu, Cicero, Hobbes. Might throw in some Kant. But then also, so these are all guys who might have influenced the founding fathers in creating the Constitution, creating the structure of our government. But you might also think about more modern philosophers like Hegel, who talks about hegemonic power, or Foucault, who talks about the panopticon, this like prison system where everyone's looking at everyone and you might talk about that in context of surveillance, mass surveillance, if a question lends itself to that. So really, you can pull from any period of philosophy for it, but you're probably going to be focused on the historical guys who influenced the founders. Um, the next category might be historical events or examples.
Ria,
So,
sorry,
oh,
I just wanted to add something really quick before you move on. I think it's really easy for folks in Unit 1, which is typically focused on philosophy, to be like, okay, I'm only doing like philosophy. And the other units to say, great, I don't have to deal with philosophy. But philosophy should be incorporated in every single one of your units. And if you are able to incorporate philosophers into your other units, it is going to stand out and show up. So it's really important not to neglect that if you're in other units.
mhm. Absolutely. And this is where hopefully what you'll be doing throughout the school year is actually really listening to your unit mates as they're presenting, or your other units. Really listen to their presentations, because your questions will be different, but there's overlap. And then knowing that, oh, I want to glean this piece of evidence from Unit 5. You don't need to go as deep into case law as Unit 5 is going to go. You don't need to go as deep into philosophy as Unit 1, or as deep into the Federalist Papers and the actual opinions of the Founding Fathers, Unit 2. But being able to really glean those specific things is going to strengthen. There's a synergy to each unit listening to other units. Um, so going next into historical events and examples, these might be a specific moment or action from history that connects to your testimony. And I think it's easy to get tripped up in sticking to the founding fathers era and modern and the in current events, unless your question specifically directs you to some other time period. But really, it's it's not even just American history when we're talking about historical events and examples. You might go to the English Civil War. You might go to uh, you might go anywhere. You might go anywhere in the world for your historical events and examples. They're just going to be relevant to your question or the questions that the judges ask you. Um, Really focus on bringing a diversity of evidence as you go into it, and ground it in the context of the time period of why are you bringing this specific piece of evidence up to further your point. Like last year, I remember a unit really wanted to talk about Shays Rebellion. They brought it up 3 different times in their testimony for different reasons, and then they brought it up again in their question and answer. And it was a good example for what they were talking about. But instead of us understanding the breadth of their historical evidence, we really it kind of shrank our world of feeling like they only understood key specific points. So you really want to pull from as much as you can, um, and really think about intentionally selecting your examples, because there's going to be a number of examples that you can use at any given point, but it should best further your argument by pulling from it. Going on to laws, actions, and policies. These are specific pieces of legislation or policies or direct action by the government or some other country's sovereign power. And also state governments, local governments. So here you guys might bring up California propositions. You might bring up laws in Australia or executive orders. It's any of the governmental actions that further your response. Going into current events, here we're saying it's something that happened within the last year of what you're researching, but I want to nuance that to say that there's certainly a difference between current events of things happening right now, recent, modern, or historic, and you really want to listen when the judges ask you for what kind of evidence that you're bringing in, because you can fudge current events to be within this year or within the last few years if there's some intentional reason that you're trying to give us that information, but I wouldn't stretch a current event to be something that happened in the Obama administration. For modern, you might want to stick to something in the last 15 or so years. And historic, you'll probably hurt a judge's feelings if you say the 90s is historic, but you might also get away with it depending on what you're going for. And if we ask for historic examples, you really want to think further back as well. So here you're going to be listening, if listening to the question or listen of the testimony or the judges, to really think of when you're trying to pull those events in. Last year, what was really a tricky one that some students dealt with really well and some students less so. We're talking about the ICE raids. And I just want to remind you that as you're dealing with heavy subject matter, really think about why you're bringing it up. Um, there was a discussion last year that we had about whether or not the ICE raids and the killings were, well, how to define them, how to bring them up, and I think that there absolutely is a reason to analyze them. But if you just bring it up and make light of the situation, that's also not that doesn't necessarily strengthen your point, and it weakens your understanding. So you're going to be dealing with heavy subject matter this year, so talk with your units. Be ready to talk about this information, but really think about how to sensitively and bring it up in a relevant way as you bring it up. I'd encourage you to think about that as you tackle that. Then we go into precedent. So these are Supreme Court cases that provide key ideas, or you might quote something to explain your ideas. So you as you think about the Supreme Court case, as Sabrina mentioned, it's good practice to cite the whole court case, including the year it came up in. So for example, you'd say Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, and then move on. But before you go into your analysis of it, give us maybe a half sentence to a one sentence summary of what the case is. Instead, you don't want this to take time out of your testimony, especially if it's a well-known case, but we also want to know that you're citing the right case, that you know what you're bringing up. So in some cases, that's actually more important than getting the full citation. If you can't remember the year, try to tell us, oh, this was in the 50s, this was in the 80s. At least that tells us that you're thinking of when you're pulling from it, even if you can't remember it. And remember, the judges aren't looking at anything either. So if you fudge it by a few years, that also probably works. Don't lie, don't make up evidence, but you're trying to keep a natural flow through your presentation as well. And we're not necessarily going to be sticklers about something as long as it makes sense in the context. You might talk about the concurrent opinion, the majority opinion, or you might give us a specific judge's opinion within the case. and all of those are deeper, more interesting types of evidence than just saying here's a court case, but not always necessary either. So you're constantly balancing how much of my knowledge am I trying to give, because does this evidence actually deepen everyone's understanding of what topic we're going into, or is it taking time? The last two
Sorry,
statistics.
one other thing, Ria.
Oh yeah.
So totally agree with Ria on all the court cases. I just want to flag that it's really puts you over the top when you're able to articulate well a concurrence versus a and cite the judge who said that. And there are certain cases where that is actually very critical. For instance, I'm thinking of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. There are many famous concurrences in there that articulate principles that end up becoming essentially the majority opinion later on or give a good sense of scope. So in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, there were different justices who had different conceptions of the scope of presidential power and when it interacts or interferes with congressional action. And the Frankfurter concurrence is one of those important ones, as well as some of the other decisions there. So really important to kind of elevate those. And just to add on, Ria said to do like a short half sentence or a sentence explanation. This is important even for cases like Brown v. Board, where the judge knows what it is. That's not the point. It's to show that you know what it is and that you have a good sense of how it applies to the situation. So it's always important to explain even the most basic principles.
Absolutely. Awesome. So moving on, we have two left. Statistics. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but it's just you're going to bring up a statistic or a trend as it furthers your point. But it's not enough to just say that the last year or in the 2024 elections, 64% of people of eligible voters turned down the U.S. You want to give us the source that you've gotten this information from, and if it's a weak source or that source is, if there's not quality in that source, it's not worth citing. The statistic is only as strong as where you're pulling it from. And it's often I often find that just the stat on its own isn't worth a lot unless it's you're using it to that. This is one where it feels like it's one of the few that you really are using it as a piece of analysis to analyze that this is an issue happening. A lot of these other ones might these other categories we're talking about might just be the evidence on its own that answers the question, but with statistics it's often being used to analyze a trend or something that's happening. So you don't want to just give us the percentage. That usually is not worth very much unless you're using it to explain something that's happening. And then lastly, personal story or anecdote. Sabrina mentioned a really good one a few minutes ago. But you really want to keep these as short and sweet as possible, as a way to further your argument. It's really easy to, if you haven't planned on the ones that you're talking about ahead of time, to get lost in the story as you're getting into it. So I would really recommend, if you think that you've got personal anecdotes that relate to your testimony or to the questions that might come up, to think about them ahead of time, to really distill them down the same way you would distill any evidence that you're planning on using in the testimony. Especially at the district level, you're going to have some teachers ask you about things like, oh, how are you civically engaged, or what does voting mean to you? And that's a great time to bring up a personal story or anecdote. But I think it's the piece of evidence that you want to use most sparingly and with the most intention, if you're bringing it in yourself without a direct question asking about it. Layla, you're asking, how do you make sure an anecdote is worth bringing up over more objective general evidence? So I think that's where you talk about it with your unit mates. And here in the process of the school year, you're either gonna really love, I hope you really love your unit mates, because you're gonna see a lot of them. You're gonna be talking through your testimony, rewriting it a lot of times, including even maybe the night before before a competition. I hope not, but you're going to be working it the whole time. And then the same way you're going to be talking about your evidence and talking about your response to questions ahead of time. So that anecdote is something you want to bring up with your team if you can ahead of time. You're going to think, oh, a lot of you might be eligible for jury duty this year. So if someone has experience with jury duty, that's probably a good one to bring up in a question that has to do with jury duty. If someone just briefly met a staffer, a congressional staffer, probably not a good piece of evidence. Yeah, Sean says you'll have lots of time to practice. I can't see his response, but yeah, you'll have lots of time to practice, and it's just a feel, and it's
Yes,
going
I
to be
said you'll have lots of time to practice during the year, so just try out your anecdotes in practice sessions, see how the judges respond to it. And as a threshold matter, you can always ask your teacher, is this a good anecdote or not?
yeah. Thanks, Sean. Yeah. And it's the same with literally all of this evidence. I think the thing that hurt the most when I was in this program is how much stuff we learned that we didn't get to bring up that we were excited to talk about. But a good unit is really going to think about being really judicious with what they choose to bring up as you go through it. The last thing I'm going to mention that I didn't mention.
Ria, can I add to that real quick?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I feel like you end up having like this gigantic library of evidence by the time you're like ready for competition. And you have to remember that like as much as you might love an example or like a certain piece of evidence, it doesn't mean that it necessarily fits into every single time that you compete. And you have to be careful about like using the evidence that makes the most sense for the questions that you're being asked, as opposed to like trying to fit your favorite thing into an answer. Because I think it's really obvious to judges when like you've dropped a piece of evidence in there that doesn't quite answer the question. And like, while we might think it's cool, it's not really doing as much as it could be doing if you picked like the right example for whatever you're being asked. So I guess just like be intentional about choosing which piece of evidence to use in response to each question.
Definitely. And then the last category thing I wanted to add is when we talk about these categories, it doesn't necessarily mean the direct source text either. You might use a constitutional scholar's analysis of that as well. So because you're gonna be pulling from so many sources, you're gonna be pulling from journalists, you're gonna be pulling from historians, scholars, and their opinions on this as well. There's one person who I think would be a great news source for you guys, Heather Cox Richardson. She has a daily email blog of something current events related. I meant to say that during the current events section, where she'd be a cool resource. And there's a number of them. We've got resources in the case chat that we might post for you guys. I had a few more thoughts, but
Yeah, I actually have the case evidence sources document in the chat, or sorry, not in the chat, but in the set of resources for summer session 2. You can also see it on our CACE website, caciviceducation.org. We'll do our best to update as we learn more throughout the year to this document, and but this is kind of a good starting place for some of the major categories.
fantastic. Yes. The last thing I wanted to mention is just really think that every time you bring something up in your testimony, whether it be evidence or analysis of it, you're opening yourself up to new questions and new conversations with the judges. If you agree or disagree with the opinion that you're bringing up, that is your evidence, or you agree or disagree with your unit mates, we want to hear that because it's going to be really interesting and add to the depth of your conversation. But you also want to think about corralling the judges specifically to the things you're ready to talk about with what you bring up. And this is that's a detail that we'll really get into as we're working with you over the school year. But everything you bring up is then going to be something that we can talk about with you, which is great. And I think only adds to the conversation, but you might be intentional in selecting the evidence that you want to talk about as well. Um, that's everything I wanted to talk about with evidence. Does anyone else have any other thoughts or questions from you guys?
I just wanted to highlight one of these sources on here. Some people don't know about this, but if you have a library card, you will have free access to an app called Libby, which will let you check out ebooks and audiobooks that are available through that library. So not only would you be able to do your local library, but actually in California, every public library throughout California allows you to register even if you don't live in that area, which means that you can collect a bunch of different library cards. For instance, I have one from San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, Pleasanton, and Las Vegas. Probably not available to you all. But as long as you live in California somewhere, you are able to get a library card with a California Public Library. And I really encourage you to do that, especially if you're like traveling to another city, scope it out. And then you'll be able to have a lot of access to some of these important books without having needing to buy it. And you can kind of check them out, see what they look like. And so it really expands the universe of evidence that's available beyond just the free resources you find on the internet.
That actually reminded me of one more thing that I don't know why it reminded me of this, but one more thing you guys should think about is as you bring up the evidence, is this just a general historical example, or is there opinion that you're injecting into it? And if so, if there's opinion to this, you should know the other side. Ideally, you bring up the other side of the argument as you bring up one side, or you have your unit mates bring it up. It's even stronger, really, if I say, I believe this, Sabrina disagrees with me, tease up Sabrina to bring in the counter argument. We love when you guys have that clear way of breaking it down for us, but you want to at least at a minimum be aware of the other side of any argument that you might bring up. Um, and I think one area that we do a good job of is you guys in this program are going to be really well versed with the conservative and the liberal side of any argument, and I think that's a good step. But then we also it might not be worth it, but at some point to know the extremes of either side is also good. I'm thinking of something way too specific right now, so I'm gonna table that unless it comes up. Yeah. Okay.
Ria, sorry, just to add a couple of things. One thing that popped up in my head was just when you get your specific questions, oftentimes, especially as you advance like further into states, some of the questions are going to be based off a quote or some source. Like sometimes it's a Federalist paper, sometimes it's a book that a scholar has written on the subject. And rather than, maybe just choosing that there are some foundational texts for each unit that you should go over, but oftentimes that can be a really good starting source. Like even just reading the chapter surrounding that quote. If you get your hands on, the full book, that's even better. That can really direct, where your time should be spent, researching. And another thing, like another, I guess, category of evidence that sort of ties into like what we were talking about with bringing up your own opinions and different sides is that, you know, maybe this is just a very unit four bias lens, but I'm sure this comes up in other places. But oftentimes there's going to be room for you to suggest reforms or ways to change our institutions. So rather than just talking about, oh, hey, historically, this is how the president has been elected. If you can bring up efforts like the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and obviously, have a scholar or someone to ground your opinions. Don't just be like, oh, I found this cool Reddit post that is suggesting, a new way to do our elections. But having pieces of evidence talking about like, I guess, sort of forward-looking, things can be helpful as well. Sort of ties into all of these a little bit, and it's not the most important thing, but if you have room to include it, it doesn't hurt for sure.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Rashab. So I think I can boot it back to you, Sabrina, so you can give them a little bit more of an idea of how this evidence is furthered with analysis for points in their testimony, in their whole discussion.
Yeah. I think that the idea is that you're not, at some point, you're going to gain all of this evidence knowledge, but you're going to just want to say it in question answer period. And it's really easy to be like, cool, done for the day. But actually, you're going to want to use the evidence to prove a point that you're making. And that's where the analysis points come in from the summer session one that I talked about in the rubric. It's really about linking evidence to the analysis to show your understanding and your thoughtfulness. So you're never going to want to bring up evidence just for the sake of evidence. You're always going to want to use each part to prove a point that you're making. As you go through this program, it's just really important, and that takes some time to understand and learn. So you're going to want to sort of build on that going forward. And we'll be talking about that plenty as the year goes on, as we go through practices with you about strategies for how to build that once you have specific examples come up. So, if we don't have any more questions on evidence for now, and there's no other additions from volunteers, I think now is a good time to take a 10-minute break. So, it's 10:52 right now, so why don't we come back at 11:03 and we will see you back in a little bit. Okay. Now that we are back, I'm going to hand it off to our esteemed Sean Gentry.
Well, hi. Thank you for rejoining, everyone. We're going to talk about classical Republican philosophy and natural rights philosophy today. I wore my Hamilton shirt in honor of this and changed my background for you. Although our founding fathers were not specifically the individuals we're talking about, some of them subscribed to these philosophies or analyzed them very deeply. And Hamilton himself was not even one of those, but more of a federalist. But people like Jefferson, Adams, Madison in particular, looked to these philosophies in working with our founding documents. Serena, do you have the PowerPoint ready to go?
You bet. One moment.
Thank you. Okay, so we often call this the Unit 1 topic, and it is. And if you're in Unit 1, you're going to analyze this all of the time. But it really is important for a lot of the units because it leads into what it means to have a presidency, what kinds of checks and balances we're going to see in our Constitution. It's going to influence case law in the U.S. Supreme Court and what we think of as the public good, even modernly. And so this topic often covers things like the British foundation of our government, colonial charters and state constitutions that sort of led into the US Constitution, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and our history leading up to the founding that played a role in the founders' decisions, and in particular, the Bill of Rights when we talk about natural rights philosophy. This flows out of the ideas of the federalism, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment era. Our founders were, of course, very well read. They often wrote to each other about these issues, about these philosophies. They all had, well, some of them had very significant libraries. In particular, we often look at John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as sort of the leaders in this area, and Madison to a degree. Abigail Adams comes into play too with some of the writings we see back and forth between John Adams and Abigail Adams, and led to this idea that we have even now of a mixed government with a strong federalism component, meaning the U.S. state national constitution supersedes and has supremacy over the states. And the framers were good because they talked a lot and they wrote a lot and they let us know what was influencing them. So we know that these issues were forefront with them, along with things like the common law from the English system, Magna Carta, etc. Let's go ahead and jump to the first substantive slide. All right, so how were the founders' views shaped? Now, these two concepts, natural rights philosophy and classical republicanism, are sometimes considered as semi-opposed. What's an individual right sometimes is contrary to what is a common good, or at least they can have a tension between like self-interest and public interest. But they both generally look to furthering society, uh, influencing things for the good of the community, even if that means your individual good. And especially classical republicanism focuses on a lack of self-interest, looking at how you can further society sometimes to your own detriment. And then the natural rights philosophy gets really into fundamental rights, what it means to have a contract with your government, a social contract, and that the government should provide for us, not necessarily us for it, versus, supporting society, securing happiness for all citizens, etc. Now, classical republicanism is older, right? It goes back to antiquity, Greek and Roman philosophy, whereas natural rights philosophy is much more modern, or I guess you would call it in the early modern era, 1600s, 1700s. And what the scholars were seeing coming out of the Renaissance in the Enlightenment era when individual rights were sort of being thought of again or for the first time, especially and we're really focused on Western Europe in this analysis. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. All right, so both traditions, of course, emphasize human nature, and we're going to talk a lot about what the purpose of politics is under both philosophies, and especially under classical republicanism, what's a good and a bad government. Sometimes called a tyranny, perhaps, is a word we're going to hear. So let's go to the next slide. And as you can compare and contrast here, we've got these political philosophies. The framers usually divided them into these two roughly opposing viewpoints, as I talked about. In the classical Republican philosophy, we're talking about the polis or the politeia. So it's the supremacy of the state or the peoples, the state over the people. And so that means we have this idea modernly, what we call legislative supremacy sometimes, where the laws passed by the state they're the supreme power over the populace. Individually, we're often looking at civic virtues. So, right, there's a subordination of the individual and a desire to promote the common good, which may be to your own detriment, right? You're looking at what makes society better. How can I be a good citizen for my society, even if that's not necessarily in my individual interest or takes a lot of effort and energy, to do that. These concepts often worked best when we're talking about homogeneous societies. Our framers looked at that idea a lot, which is similarly situated demographic groups with similar ideologies all living together. Made it easier, of course, to promote one common good, led to stability and justice and a functional social hierarchy. Natural rights, differs to some degree because we're talking about individuals, natural persons versus your civil person, which is, the person that is promoting the government and society. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the state of nature means. So what was it like without government and how that influences what a government should be coming out of that state. We're going to talk a lot about fundamental rights and individual sovereignty, which leads into the Bill of Rights in particular, and this idea of social contract, which is really big in the natural rights philosophy. So let's jump to the next slide. All right, so who are your classical Republican philosophers? The Greek and antiquity brought us Plato and Aristotle, right? So these are individuals who were really thinking about what it is to have a republican or democratic form of government at that time. Sometimes they call it civic humanism. You may hear that term. And this is, as I mentioned, antiquities. This is before the Renaissance revival of these ideas. And what these philosophers focused on was human nature. What does it mean to be virtuous, to support your community, and have a high morality? And morality often in this context means for the good of society. So what does it mean to have morality for the good of your neighbors? Um, the polis is the state, our system, our ruling government, our ruling group. And when we get into Roman times, we see Cicero, who heavily influenced, or sometimes called Cicero, heavily influenced John Adams on thinking about how these should be incorporated into our form of government. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned the polis a couple of times, form of government. Um, humans, both philosophies actually talk about human beings as animals, social creatures, and what it means to sort of form a social hierarchy. But we have unique capacities and talents compared to other animals. We form social constructs, social structures. We support each other in ways that many other animal groups don't. To make strong communities, and then ultimately, hopefully, have a happy society that's virtuous and meaning not necessarily selfish. This is a very optimistic philosophy. Humans have a unique excellence. We're capable of rhetoric, of speaking to each other, communicating well, sharing ideas. But this does require a level of education, right? So there are good ideas and bad ideas, or all ideas have some value, but we want to be able to understand each other's ideas and weed through them to figure out what is actually good for our society in order to then have a government that has order, discipline, and a public spiritedness. And public spiritedness means, often in this context, engagement, right? That where the populace is engaged in making the society better, both at a government level and within your community, sometimes at a religious level, and making sure we're promoting the common good. And these were often in the city-states of Greek and Rome. So again, these smaller, homogeneous societies that sometimes were, of course, at odds with each other. The Spartans and the Athenians didn't always see it the same way about what makes a good society and what's for the common good or civic virtue. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so when we talk about politics, right? So what's the purpose of making a government over the people? And the classical Republicans would say it's to help humanity, to help our society achieve excellence and happiness in their small contained communities. As we've looked at this in modern times, obviously our communities are sometimes considered to be much larger, much less homogeneous, both demographically and when it comes to the ideas of those societies. But if you really do, drill down into your local neighborhood, your local government, these ideas still do hold up and then get strained a little bit more as we talk about the federal government, where there's a lot of different ideas, but still led into what the framers wanted to do with our Constitution. Obviously, we're promoting civic virtue. We've talked about self-interest a little bit more with the natural rights philosophy, but the classical Republicans would still say we want to have an enlightened self-interest. This is an educated populace that may have some self-interest, but that self-interest is shared for the good of society. So it's things that we're enlightened about. We're not just like trying to make ourselves rich or whatever it is. And obviously, not everyone will follow this philosophy, but that's the goal. And then when we talk about common good, one very fundamental idea of that is defense, right? Natural rights philosophers get into this too. It's what happens when society is brutal and there are outside forces trying to destroy your community or society. And in order to come together for the common good, we may need a strong defense. This might be a military. There's other ways of defending a society, but the U.S. obviously really subscribes to this. We have the strongest military in the world, and spend a lot of resources toward our defense of our country. Let's go to the next slide. All right, there are good and there are bad governments. Uh, Under classical republicanism, the idea of a good government tends to be comes from small self-contained communities. Again, the word homogeneous comes up and has a proper balance. So we're going to talk about sort of aristocracy versus you know, the other areas of society, the working class. And so we're in a good government, there's a balance that looks to the interests of multiple classes within that government. Again, education is a extremely important topic among classical rights philosophers, even in antiquity, so that everyone is educated and will vote well. Like there's an idea of uneducated masses voting being a bad thing. And our founders really shared this view, actually. So the goal then is wise deliberative rule. In an ideal situation, that's probably a philosopher king, somebody who really understands these issues and is looking out for the common good of society and not what the Romans and Cicero will start calling a tyrant, like a Caesar, who is really in it for themselves or their own power, their family's power. Machiavelli sometimes is looked at as an example of a philosopher who espoused that concept, which is contrary to a good government in classical republicanism. We want our citizens to be virtuous and again have strong defenses. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so contrast this with a bad government. So this is uncontrolled passions. And so, to some degree, natural rights philosophy allows for uncontrolled passions. But in classical republicanism, um, greed, avarice, those kinds of ideas are contrary to a good government. So it's not about the delegates, it's not about the Republican representatives and what's in their best interest. It's about what helps society be successful and fend off its enemies from other small homogeneous communities. If there's a preoccupation with material goods and pleasures, that's bad. Obviously, I guess I would say when you look at Rome, obviously our founders looked at the bad version of Roman government too. They really idolized the Republican era of Rome, before Caesar sort of came on the scene, and then we had the emperors that followed. And then they look at those emperors as kind of a bad example because they're often focused on unchecked expansion, unchecked individual power, and their goods and pleasures and passions. They were not considered civically virtuous. They are self-interested rulers. And again, the word often used for that is tyrant among classical Republican philosophers. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So then we had early state governments. So many of our founding fathers, both at the state and federal level, um, read about this. They talked to each other about this. They looked at what it meant. They also came from England, right? And that's important to note because it influenced their ideas. So you had up in the Boston area, religion was really influencing government. You had Quakers, of course, in Pennsylvania, Puritans, even in like we're looking at Jamestown, you had Anglicans. So they had this idea of religious homogeny as well. Obviously, in our early era, there was mostly white Western European settlers living among, of course, the Native Americans here. And so there was this homogenous idea among the different early state governments and colonial charters. And so that really lended itself well to a classical Republican idea, but also they saw what didn't always work where they came from in England, in Dutch communities, back in Europe, where there was religious persecution and things of that nature. So they really looked at what can we do to promote the civic virtue in our individual societies in a way that made us unique from where those settlers had come from back in Europe. Um, there was typically residency and property requirements for voting back then. And of course, we do want to identify that it was really white men, white landholding men who had the power or led our system of governments. And that is, worth noting because obviously that's not the society we have now today. And it did influence sort of what they considered to be civic virtue and what sort of goals they had for their small homogeneous communities. All right, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to pause for a second while I just double check my notes and see what else I've got here. Um, yeah, one concept I just didn't mention is this idea of a public life versus a private life. And so when you're talking about citizenship, what does it mean to be a citizen of your society? It's not just about civic virtue and doing things for the public good. There's also this idea that you have a duty to have a public life, not just a private life, if you are a citizen as opposed to just sort of one of the non-voting masses, and that you're out there doing this service yourself with your family, with your community members, and that it's not just a right to vote or a right to have citizenship. You have a duty that goes along with that. I often think of Starship Troopers for to use a really weird, off the cuff media reference, but when you look at the early parts of that movie, they kind of go into this idea of class republicanism that you can only be a citizen if you serve. And there are countries in around the world that do require that. You look at Germany or Israel, other countries who require some sort of public service in order to have citizenship or the right to vote or something along those lines. So not everyone was a citizen. Not everyone had the right to vote. It was also true in our founding era. We also want to identify the idea of sex slavery that did exist both in antiquity and in our founding era. Um, Obviously, in a negative way, the slavery concepts were different. But of course, if you were a slave, you did not have these rights. You were not a citizen. You did not have the right to vote. You did not have the same rights as the ruling class or the individuals who were actually represented in the democracy of our states, our early states, and even in our federal government after the founding. Um, so that of course was an issue that existed for a long time and had to be rectified with amendments to the Constitution and the like. There was also not universal suffrage. Women generally did not have the right to vote for a long time, even after the eradication of slavery. So not until the 20th century did women have a universal right to vote, especially at the federal level. So, these are issues that were imperfect in a classical Republican society and imperfect in our United States society that were perhaps resolved to some degree over time. So that takes us to our founding documents. So the Constitution in particular is a classical Republican document, whereas the Bill of Rights is usually considered a natural rights philosophy document. We can also look at the Articles of Incorporation. I'm sorry, the Articles of Confederacy, um, which was preceding the Constitution. And they had this idea of um, classical republicanism built into them and what sort of rights and obligations we had, what the legislature was expected to do, et cetera. And we also saw in the colonial charters and the state constitutions a lot of these ideas as well, in large part because the people making those documents were some of the same people, right? Especially from Virginia and the Boston area or the Massachusetts area. And in Pennsylvania, you'd have, and New York, I guess, too, you'd have, these individuals who are making these state constitutions then coming to Philadelphia to make our United States Constitution. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so we just touched on this. I mentioned two of them. You've got Massachusetts, you've got Pennsylvania. These are from their state constitutions following the Declaration of Independence. And you'll see some of the concepts here. I'm not going to read them for you, but you can see them on the chart there. Um, Another founding document I'll just mention in passing that we'll talk about more later is the Declaration of Independence, right? So the state constitutions come after that point, after we declare independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence is therefore an influence here, but more of a natural rights philosophy concept. But let's go to the next slide. So we didn't have Virginia on there, but the Virginia House of Burgesses was an early colonial legislative body that really looked into these ideas early on. So we just mentioned Declaration of Independence, early state constitutions, Constitution of the U.S. I think we've touched on those, so let's move to the next slide. All right, so classical republicanism within the U.S. Constitution. We look at the preamble, we the people, right? This is a document that exists for the purpose of the the polis, the group of individuals who are coming together to be citizens in the society, right? It's not about any one individual. It's not about individual rights. And then we look at this idea of representation, right? So classical republicanism is a republic, right? It's not a democracy in the lowercase d sense where all of the people are participating in the running of our government. It's representatives who are running our government on our behalf. The Senate is a very classical Republican example of this concept and how there are representatives for the state as a whole. Um, Often, looking at classical republicanism, we've talked about these eligibility requirements, right? So landholding white men typically. Now, the landholding part, even in the late 1700s, was starting to be less of a requirement in some places. Certainly back in Europe, it was typically required to be in the aristocracy to be a citizen, or at least be a representative in our government. But that started to go by the wayside in the United States or in the early colonies. And then the other concept we have is federalism, right? So the plenary legislative powers left to the states. So it allowed those more homogenous communities to run themselves through their own legislative bodies, which of course, in large part, was a little bit self-interested because the founders, the framers, came from their respective states and they wanted their respective states to retain a lot of that power. The anti-federalists in particular really wanted the states to be more strong in comparison to the federal government. The Federalists had the opposite idea when you look at Hamilton in particular. But we definitely still landed on a federalist system where states do have plenary legislative power within their own states as long as it's not superseded by the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and the laws of the land. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to turn to natural rights philosophy and do a little compare and contrasting, which we've already been doing. Natural rights philosophy is really focused on rights, obviously, or fundamental rights, but also on the idea of sovereignty. So having power over yourself, or having the people having power over their future, over their leaders, and what that means. The early natural rights philosophers that we always talk about are Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. So very Unit 1 specific. These individuals, again, from Northwestern Europe, so France, England in particular, they influenced especially people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, some of the other framers, in understanding how there should be a balance between the public good that we've talked about and individual rights. Um, so let's see. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so one fundamental idea when we're talking about natural rights philosophy is what is human nature? Classical Republican talked about our social community founding nature. And natural rights takes a little bit of a different view and says we're not necessarily social or political by nature. We're selfish. Um, in a state of nature, we're all equal, right? There's no government, nobody's ruling any other person. We're all equal. We're all free to carry out our individual self-interest. Um, and there's no sort of like executive power where one king is ruling over the populace or anything like that. The problem in this state of nature is we have to be protected from one another, right? There's no rules in place to prevent one person's self-interest from interfering with another person's self-interest, either through violence or taking our goods and houses, whatever it is. And so, in order to have a functional society, we will ultimately have to protect ourselves from one another and potentially band together in order to do that. Um, Natural rights philosophy also has a contrary view that happiness is a personal or private matter, as opposed to sort of a utilitarian idea of, societal happiness being more important than individual happiness. Let's go to the next slide. So then in looking at those ideas, what are the purposes of politics? And they're different. They're about self-preservation, making sure our stuff is not taken from us and we're not, killed by other people who are engaged in their own self-interest. It's to maintain order, to have a society that functions and allows everyone to coexist. And of course, to protect rights and liberties, which is different than what we saw sort of pre-Enlightenment. And rights and liberties, include the right to life, for example, to your property, etc. And then, of course, the idea of common defense, which is somewhat true in both philosophies. Next slide. All right, so again, we're going to talk about good governments versus bad governments. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a fun little graphic over on the side that talks about the different aspects of government as being the pillars of our society. But in a natural rights philosophy government, people are sovereign. We have the right to choose our leaders. We have the right to choose for ourselves how we want our society to be run. There's again an optimism in this concept that individuals are self-sufficient. They're capable of running their own lives. Um, and so if there's going to be a government, it should be a government by consent, right? There's no reason to form a government if our rights are otherwise our own rights in an individualized society, unless those rights are still protected by our government. Obviously, that's a little bit idealistic. It doesn't always work out that way. Um, but now we're starting to get into this idea of rule of law. And I guess classical republicanism has this too, but rule of law means the government itself has to obey the laws, right? So the king or the monarch or the emperor, or whatever it is not a tyrant. They can't just do whatever they want without any accountability. The government needs to function based on agreed upon rules from our representatives. And so we start to see this in the West, in our English common law with Magna Carta, with the English Declaration of Right, things of that nature that start to say, look, the monarch has to follow the rules, and they can't just unilaterally punish individuals or engage in self-interest outside of what our representatives want that is the best for us. And we really still have this concept today under this idea of a rule of law in the United States, maybe the most important or one of the most important concepts of our form of democratic republicanism government. And hopefully, everyone's following the law. There's a difference here where we have the public and private spheres separate. So in the classical republicanism idea, if you are a citizen, you owe yourself to be part of the public sphere and be a, civically virtuous citizen. Your private life was not really very private. Whereas in natural rights philosophy, you do have your private life. Your home is your castle. You get to sort of keep those things separate to some degree and have individual ideas that aren't always consistent with what's good for the government as a whole. Ideally, the government is providing what the people want. Security, as Hobbes would say, is sort of the number one priority, being safe from your fellow man. Locke would say, no, it's really more individual liberty, protection of your property, um, and being able to sort of live your life in a happy, productive way without the government overstepping its bounds. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's contrast this with a bad government. So in a bad government under natural rights philosophy, it's not representative, right? So it's not selected by the sovereign, the people who have sovereignty, and it also doesn't necessarily represent the same interests as those people who have their sovereignty. So it's doing its own thing and maybe chosen by a group of individuals who are not the represented body. It's not responsive, meaning it doesn't listen to or adhere to the interests and the rights of its people. So it violates those rights, through taking away property, taking away liberty, jailing individuals, for example. And then it's not law abiding. It doesn't follow a rule of law, which again is a very fundamental idea of both systems of government. And if it's not law abiding, then it's tyrannical. Let's go to the next slide. And so, in order to get to a good government, these natural rights philosophers say we have to enter into a social contract with our leaders, with our government. And so we get Thomas Hobbes, starts talking about this, and Locke and Rousseau really expound on it. What is a social contract? And so you can see the quote here from Hobbes, but it's basically an agreement between all of the individual society to form a government, and the there's been a couple pictures of this here down at the bottom right, but this is from the Leviathan. And you can see in this picture the body of the king. And again, Hobbes was from England. The body of the king is made up of thousands of individuals. So it's hard to see, but all those little circles are people, right? Making up the body, the polis of our government. And the head is the king, right? So the king doesn't have a head without the body and without the social contract created by our society. And then, of course, you can see in, I guess, what is his right hand, a sword, because Hobbes, talks a lot about protection of society. And then I'm not really sure what that is in his right hand, the scepter, liberty, peace, rights, being the ideas of what government is here to provide for us. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so we're still talking about Hobbes. We're fearing death. We need a society in order to form this Leviathan to provide a supreme power. Now, Hobbes was not necessarily like a, I'm going to say Democrat with a capital D, but like somebody who was looking at sort of a representative democracy. He still understood that the social contract allowed for a monarchy, right? So a king, and that king was the head of the Leviathan and was the supreme power of the state with absolute dominion over all. So it's not necessarily in our interest for protecting fundamental rights, but was a necessary, I'll call it evil, necessary situation under the social contract in order to protect our life and protect ourselves from death and fear and war. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just let you read this here. So more Hobbes. All right, so we're still focused on war. Let's go to the next slide. All right, and then we get to John Locke. John Locke is a little bit more of an optimist, a little bit more of a Democrat with a capital, with a lowercase d. And when he talks about social contract, he says the governed are agreeing to give up their absolute liberties to hand authority over to the state. The state exists under this social contract to protect our property, and it's really a contract between us and the government so that we all will abide by the law, including the leaders, against those who would violate our rights. And we also are still looking at the idea of foreign invaders, right? So there, in all of these societies, we're looking at how we protect ourselves from people outside of our sovereign state, who are the enemies of our society, and also then the criminals within our society who are not following the law, and how the state can punish them in our stead so that it keeps us safe. Let's go to the next slide. So then Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes along, and he wrote a book or a treatise called The Social Contract. So he's, maybe the one who really sort of rounded out this concept. But it's essentially an idea that we are born free, we're the masters of ourselves, and we only consent to be governed before a society can form and then rule over us in a way that we consent to, that hopefully is in our interest and protects our fundamental rights. Let's go to the next slide. So you see some arguments here from Rousseau about what he believes to be a pre-civilized society. It's very similar to Hobbes, or I'm sorry, it's dissimilar to Hobbes, where he says we're not necessarily warlike as in our human nature, but we're peaceful. Um, but once we have property rights, people want to take that away from each other, and that necessitates the existence of a state getting involved in our personal lives. So he has this theory of human development that you can see on the screen here, but really talks about our growth as a species from a sort of a savage society to a society that's more optimal, strikes a middle ground between oppression and protecting our individual rights, and especially from the seizure of property by other individuals. Um, you can see right in the middle here, he also notes education. So we haven't talked about that as much with natural rights philosophy, but education is important to understand what rights we have and how to elect representatives that will look out for our rights and not be tyrants. Let's go to the next slide. All right. This is a little bit of a trick question. So, which principles of natural rights philosophy would I expect to find in Americans' founding documents? So, I guess it's not a trick question. I thought it was contrasting with classical republicanism because they're both in our founding documents. But when we talk about natural rights philosophy, the number one thing we're looking to in our US government is the Bill of Rights, right? This is a very natural rights philosophy concept. These are the rights that we have as society in order to um, be protected and have rule of law from the people who are actually ruling over us. So let's go to the next slide. The Declaration of Independence is also a very natural rights philosophy heavy document, primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, but it talks about how the King of England is essentially trampling on our rights as members of society in the colonies, and in particular, how we are not represented, right? So that was a big gripe of our founding fathers leading up to the Declaration of Independence, is that the colonists felt that their colonies and their individuals and their colonial governments were not represented in the English government and the Parliament back in England, right? There was this idea of virtual representation, that there are Englishmen who lived in England who represented our interests, and that's not what what natural rights philosophy is about. That's not a adequate social contract between the governed and the governors. And so, we declared independence for that reason. The early state constitutions had some of these ideas as well. There were Bill of Rights types documents in some of the colonial um, charters, and especially in the colonial state constitutions that were founded sort of after the Declaration of Independence, particularly the one out of Virginia, which largely influenced the Bill of Rights at our federal level. The Constitution itself, of course, has some specific concepts within it that are natural rights as well, such as habeas corpus or right to habeas corpus, and things that are in the Constitution that give us individual rights in addition to the classical Republican ideas of how our government should be structured. And then again, the rule of law permeates all of this, right? The constitutions um, are the law, right? They're the law of the land, and it's not up to the individual rulers or the president to determine what the law is without it being constitutional, right? So if something's at odd with our Constitution or our Bill of Rights or the laws that have flowed out of that, then it is not appropriate under the rule of law, and that's sort of why we have a court system, or at least a Supreme Court system, to determine through judicial review what is constitutional under the rule of law and cannot be trampled on by the whims of our representatives or our executive branch. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so in our early states governments, here's some examples. We've already kind of touched on this. Um, Oh, there's a nice little note here on this slide. So the Bill of Rights sometimes came first, right? So there are some state governments leading up to our federal constitution that actually adopted a Bill of Rights before they adopted like a governing constitutional document. Um, so, they were really focused on these natural rights. But when they did form constitutions, it was very clear this was intended to be a social contract. A lot of times we talk about limited government in natural rights philosophy. Unit one, you're going to want to remember that's this concept of limited government and that the government is limited by the constitution we form with it, right? So the government doesn't have rights to pass laws or take away property or jail us unless it's provided for in our social contract with those governing bodies. Of course, the legislatures that flow out of that can pass new laws that are part of the social contract, but ultimately, hopefully, everyone's following the rule of law and not acting in their own interest as our executive officers or legislative officers. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so here's some examples. Obviously, the Constitution has a Bill of Rights. There's an example from the Virginia Bill of Rights right here. I won't read it off the screen, but you can see what they were looking on. Now, note that the Virginia Bill of Rights was from 1776, so the same time as the Declaration of Independence, essentially. So they were one of the leaders in this area. And they're already passing a Bill of Rights, as we're still fighting England or just getting started fighting England. Next slide. All right, some examples within the Constitution. I mentioned habeas corpus earlier. The preamble, while a classical Republican idea, also talks about the rights of the people, right? So this is why we're forming our society to protect our rights. Just the concept of a written constitution in and of itself is a social contract idea or a natural rights idea, so that we have something. Now, a constitution does not have to be written. There are countries that have unwritten constitutions that are sort of referenced by the actions of their leaders and the case law that comes out of that and other forms of documentation or verbal decision making that forms their constitution. But it's nice to have it in writing, obviously. And as a lawyer, I'll say, always get it in writing. The idea of separation of powers and checks and balances, we haven't talked about a lot, but that is an idea of protecting individual liberty and protecting individual rights so that one branch of government can't enter into tyranny and start trampling on our individual rights without being checked by some other branch. In particular, the legislative body are our direct representatives and hopefully are able to check both each other and also the executive branch. The courts exist to check all of that. Another idea we should just mention in passing is the Senate versus the House. That's to some degree initially intended to sort of represent multiple areas of society. So sort of the upper aristocratic classes versus the farmers, the House, the more rural or regular folk who represent our society. So that there's a balance, right? We've talked about balance before. But ultimately, there is a legislative supremacy. This is the rule of law concept. If there are laws passed, we must follow them and our leaders must follow them as well. Um, a nice little idea here is impeachment, of course, and removal from office if you can't follow the rule of law. And then in order to check the government, we have elections, right? So going all the way back to the beginning, the idea of sovereignty is really important to the natural rights philosophers, that we have sovereignty over our people, or I'm sorry, over our system of government, and we're able to choose for ourselves who is our leader and how they represent us. And so voting goes into that, and also term turnover, right? So in order to continue to be represented on an adequate level, we have to be able to vote in frequent elections, so however often that is, 2 years, 4 years, whatever, in order to be adequately represented. Typically, once there's a social contract in place, elections and laws, the passage of laws is how we change that social contract. But otherwise, we're sort of voting with our feet by living here, right? If we live in this society, we're tacitly consenting to our social contract with that society. Next slide. A nice quote from James Monroe, which I hope I don't get this wrong, was our fifth president. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, is that the last slide?
Evidently.
All right, so let's ask that question then, not just listen to James Monroe. Did they strike the right balance? This is rhetorical, right? Everyone can have their own opinion. Is there a good balance between classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy? I think certainly there's a yes answer to some degree. There can be a no answer, or it could have been better type of answer. Um, are we adequately represented? Are we um, able to have a social contract that works for everyone? Are we able to defend ourselves adequately versus making sure we have sufficient individual rights? Is there sufficient consent of the people to be governed by the people who are governing us? Oh no, I have in my notes here, Monroe was the fifth president. So that I wouldn't mess it up. And then, of course, I sort of messed it up 2 minutes ago. Um, yeah, so we can put this question to the audience if you want, Sabrina, or just open the audience to ask any questions at the end of this discussion. And I'll say one more thing there's a lot of other ideas that go into some of these about forms of government. And when we work with Unit 1, we'll dig a little bit deeper. Like, for example, Aristotle sort of created this idea of, what kinds of governments were good and bad, government of the one, the few, the many. So talking about like a monarchy versus an aristocracy versus the polity um, for the common good, or looking at when it's a bad form of government like tyranny, oligarchy, democracy, being ruled by people who are out for their own self-interest. So there are deeper concepts that I'll love to get into with Unit 1 when we get there. But for now, any questions?
I have a question, Sean.
Yes.
When you get a question in testimony or Q&A that's asking if something in particular is more classical republicanism versus natural rights philosophy, is there a right answer all the time?
Not all the time. So there could be a right answer depending on which thing is being pointed to. But usually, and especially if we're talking about a founding document, it's going to be some of both, right? Even within the Bill of Rights, we're going to find ideas that might be more classical republicanism than natural rights philosophy. And certainly within the Constitution, it's a mixed bag. And our founders mixed these ideas all the time too, right? When they were talking to each other, when they were looking at different forms of government to see what was ideal for our society, they really did both, and they were trying to strike a balance. So that usually means an aspect of society is somewhere in the middle. And one way you can handle that potentially is something Sabrina and Ria, I think, said earlier, which is disagreement among your panel mates, right? So one person can say, well, I really think that the Declaration of Independence is a classical Republican document because it talked about, X, Y, and Z, common good. And someone else can say, no, I disagree. I think it's a natural rights philosophy document because it focused on the trampling of our individual rights and the lack of representation in from our members of the colonies in the parliament or whatever it is. And so, of course, you want to give your reasons why you think it's one over the other. But I think, Serena, you're trying to get me to say it's both. There may be a couple, like, a very, very targeted question that it really is just one, it's a natural rights concept, and not a classical Republican concept. But that you'd have to kind of get pretty narrow into the question before I think that becomes the answer.
Right. And yeah, just to add on to that a little bit, if you're sitting there going, wow, I feel like it could be both. It's probably because the answer lends itself to both.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, especially when people are talking about the First Amendment, sometimes you can get kind of both because you think, oh, rights, that's clearly natural rights philosophy. I get the right to speak. But a lot of time, the First Amendment is also designed to make it better for everyone, and that can have elements of common good too.
Yeah.
Also, for instance, there's a principle in the First Amendment that we'll get to talk about more in this year and maybe in the next summer session about how First Amendment, the right to free speech, is also good for society because it gives sort of a safety valve. This idea that people, if they're able to talk and speak their mind, they're less likely to use violence in order to accomplish their goals. So ultimately, that can be sort of a common good principle too. So I encourage you to really learn these two sets of philosophies really deeply so that you can articulate how maybe something can show both sides of things as well.
Yeah, I want to add on to that last part about education too. Both philosophies really emphasize education. For classical republicanism, it's in order to be virtuous, right? So that you understand what the goals are of society and you can go out and further those goals with your civic person. Natural rights philosophy, it's more to do with understanding how to be governed without having your rights trampled. There's a little bit of an overlap with religion also, especially in classical rights philosophy and what it means to be sort of virtuous in that sense. Um, and then another example I like to kind of build on what Sabrina was saying with the First Amendment is jury duty. Like jury duty is a fun one to comment on. Like which one is that? Is that which philosophy does that follow? And it's a both answer. So in order to serve on a jury, right, that's a common good, civically virtuous thing to do, right? You're going outside of your way, it's not necessarily in your self-interest to be serving on a jury and spending your time that way, but you're doing it to ensure that your peers aren't, um, being jailed inappropriately. But that concept is a natural rights concept, right? To be jailed without due process, without a jury of your peers, and so to avoid tyranny from the government, essentially, and protecting your right to life and liberty and property. Which I didn't talk about that term so much, but Declaration of Independence, right? So life, liberty, and property are the fundamental rights of classical republicanism. I'm sorry, natural rights philosophy. And then Jefferson, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not totally synonymous with property, but intended, I think, to be a little broader.
I also just wanted to articulate some stuff from the chat. There was a question, would it be valuable to study some people with conflicting controversial views to see how they challenge natural rights and republicanism? For example, Thomas Paine's later writings. And CACE volunteer Josh says, of course, obviously you want a strong base in both natural rights and uh, CR, but building up a wide variety of opinions and perspectives is key to being super successful in We the People, as long as you explain why you're using this alternative opinion, because the biggest thing you want is to have a perspective that you yourself agree with and to understand the other side too. And just to add to this, and I think it's really important to remember, we often say, oh, these philosophers and the founders who relied on the philosophers, there's kind of an assumption that maybe like they kind of got it right or they are individuals that we should revere, but it is totally fine to disagree with them or to think that their project or the principles and philosophies that they relied on were incorrect. And one thing to remember is these philosophers that were relied on by the founders are great, but there's also been a lot of philosophers who have spoken on these issues since, and even more contemporary. I'm thinking of philosophers like John Rawls, who have, I think, a really good understanding and have built off of this idea of natural rights philosophy. And so don't be afraid to look at more contemporary philosophers to understand better these and build on these original ideas and also to critique them too. You're allowed to critique them, and I encourage you to do so.
Yeah, and
And
I think also kind of adding to Sabrina's point, remember who these people were in 1770s, right? We're talking about white aristocratic men who were meeting in Philadelphia to form our system of government and tended to be the leaders of their own colonies and societies. And so they're not necessarily like these ideas benefit them. Like one of the fears was a society of the masses, right? The farmers taking control, which happened in Virginia for a brief period of time. And certainly they had many of them had slaves, didn't necessarily see other races or demographic groups as equal. And women, of course, were not treated equally to men in this era. So and the philosophers were also white Western men too. So, there is a lens that sort of benefits that aristocratic group that has evolved over time to form a more perfect union, as I would say, as somebody would say.
then we got another question in other units except Unit 1, what ways could you apply or talk about natural rights or uh, CR. So I think it applies across the board, and it's a little bit hard to talk about this in the abstract. I think we already gave you two examples that would definitely apply in the context of Unit 5. um, First Amendment principles. And I think especially for units 3 and 5, which are talking a lot about natural rights, when you're talking about the Bill of Rights, how it's incorporated to the states, the rights of folks gaining in the Reconstruction era following the Civil War.
Yeah.
All of these are going to be very much obviously natural rights philosophies, but again, I think as Sean and I highlighted with jury duty and like the First Amendment, there's a lot of ways to connect it as well to other principles. And but I think it applies across the board. And Unit
Mhm.
2 and Unit 4, they're talking about the founders and the institutions that they built. All these institutions, like fundamentally, are about trying to balance these two philosophies in a way that makes sense. And so, anytime you're talking about an institution set forth in the Constitution, you could probably link it to one of these two philosophies.
Mhm.
I'd
Unit
add even
6 too. Good, Ria.
Oh yeah, I'd add even from the start of the country of like where we're talking we're assuming that the founding fathers had a certain feel that that their natural rights were being infringed on. But really there's a question of who's natural who were they right to feel like their natural rights were being infringed on versus the classical republican the nature of the British English government trying to protect them, trying to protect the English government itself, the people in England, so that this tension shows up literally throughout the entirety of American history, through global history, where there's government, there's that tension of who are you protecting, and how
Mhm.
are the citizens being adequately protected, and are they adequately allowed their freedoms? That tension isn't in any government.
Yeah, and I mean the ability to change your government is really fundamental too. And so like Article 5 allows for amendments. So Sabrina mentioned in the Reconstruction era, we obviously had three very important amendments to our Constitution flow out of the Civil War. And that, I think you could argue for some classical Republican ideas, but it's definitely a natural rights philosophy idea to be able to change your social contract through an amendment to a governing document,
And one
hopefully
thing,
for the better.
right. And one small thing I'd like to add, if you like to read or watch movies or stories involving fantasy or science fiction, a lot of times these principles are fundamental to the story. And once you kind of have a good grasp on it, you can sort of pick out those elements. So I've read Rising series here. That is all about that concept of a philosopher king and how classical republicanism can come in tension with natural rights philosophy and the society that you're building. And a lot of dystopian novels, if you like that, bring it up as well.
Starship Troopers.
What did you say?
I said Starship Troopers,
Oh, yeah.
which I mentioned already.
Which I think that just kind of speaks to the fact that like the ideas here of like how we're treated as individuals, how we live as a society are like big human questions, right? Like we were talking about a specific set of philosophers, but like as long as there have been people, people have been grappling with the idea, some of the ideas here. And so, if you're looking at other philosophers or other times, other places, you can find things that are relevant. If you look at fiction, you can find things that are relevant. And I promise, like, I think right now, a lot of times when we're in summer session, the idea of the school year program and exactly what that would look like feels kind of abstract. And you're like, how will I apply this? I promise you, the second you're getting into this, you're like, oh, I see exactly how I can apply this. Like, it's very, very relevant. It's relevant to our lives today.
And I would encourage whoever's in Unit 1 or any units to reach out to me again because I'm like looking at my notes here and there's, if you're grappling with these issues, like I have so many things that I didn't talk about just because of the time constraints. But Saint Thomas Aquinas was on there. We didn't even get into him, but he's got some unique ideas that built off of Aristotle and Plato. So dig deeper, I guess, is where I'm going with this, and I'm happy to be here as a resource if you need it.
Okay, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. Actually, we're going to take a 9-minute break just to keep us on task. So we'll come back at 12:10 and then we'll finish off the remaining bits. We'll get some tips and tricks about how you can be successful in this program from CASE, as well as doing some breakout sessions to talk about a lot of these issues that we've discussed today. So see you at 12:10. All right, folks, we are back for the home stretch. And as we come back, we are going to start off by going over some We the People tips and tricks. So I'm going to invite Ernest to present on that. Ernest, are you ready?
Yes.
Great. Did you want me to share my screen for the presentation or do you want to do it yourself?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, one sec.
Sorry, my camera is a bit weird right now.
Ernest, real quick, why don't you introduce yourself to the students?
Oh yeah, good idea. Um, all right. Can you see me? Oh, you can. Okay, great. All right. So my name is Ernest Zhang. I'm a alum of the We the People program, and I went to Foothill High School, and I was part of the Unit 5 team there. So happy to be here today. I prepared this presentation for you guys. All right, we will take tips and tricks from a 2025 alum. Please. Can you hear me? Can I control the slides? Uh-oh. Okay, great. So number one, read the news. Oh, okay. Read the news. Just keep updated with current events. Here's like three news platforms that I frequented in my We the People time. Obviously, since I was part of Unit 5 and we deal a lot with Supreme Court cases, a lot of the news I consumed was about the Supreme Court. But this also goes for any type of news organization that you might follow. This might also go for like podcasts and stuff. And frequently, even our own coaches would send articles that they find interesting to us. So, share all of the news that you read with your friends and your unit mates. Next
Ernest,
slide.
question for you. Law 360 is my jam
Yeah.
for being a lawyer, but is there a student version or a way to get access to that without the paywall?
Mm, believe- I think
Um,
like I'm actually because I used Law 360 this year. I think last year we used a lot of like if you just search up like First Amendment stuff or any amendment stuff, tell you like they'll give you like case law. And I'm not sure which website it is because it's like on the tip of my tongue, but I don't remember. Do you remember? Okay, I guess I don't remember. But Justia is also a good site for like does someone speak? My bad. Justia is a good sort of site for Supreme Court cases. It's sort of like a hub for all of your case law from like even the time of the founders to now. Yeah, next slide. All right, number two, outline your testimony. So, you don't want to write your introduction before you write the rest of your uh, article. This goes for any type of academic writing that you will ever do. You want to outline whatever you're going to write first. So, how does this work? You start off with structure, right? Introduction, evidence number one, key point number two, stuff like that. And then you can go in and add the fluff, right? Don't try to be Shakespeare in your first go around. And then once you have that sort of base skeleton of a testimony finished, then you can go and fill out and flesh out all of your key points and your evidence. The because if you follow this structure, it will help you in writing your testimonies efficiently and also very clearly. Because if you start off writing, poetry, it might be hard to get a key idea of what your testimony is supposed to convey to the judges. Right, next. Number three, debate and argue your positions. And you should be doing this at all like times of your synthesis, right? Before you write your testimony, during like the writing, and also after you finish, right? Disagreements are not bad in We the People. In fact, they should be encouraged. And so like your testimony is probably never going to be final right until like the eve of competition. So always try to gain a better understanding of your position. And how do you do that? You challenge it by introducing different viewpoints and considering and weighing the arguments that come with both sides. Also, please don't come to competition with your first draft. Yeah, you're cooked if you do that. But that's why you guys got to be revising your drafts, your testimonies as you continue on in the competition cycle. All right. Tip number 4, get feedback. So this is actually like a very important tip because some units will just vanish off the face of the earth up until competition. And you don't want to be that unit that like never has gotten feedback from like their coaches. And there have been instances in the football team in the past, or so I've heard, where literally students will like not be seen by our coach for like a whole week. So don't be that unit. Get feedback. Literally ask anyone. It doesn't have to be like the teacher, but you can ask your parents, your English teacher, or your history teacher, or anyone who's educated in civics. Um, Ask for their feedback. I mean, we contacted professors frequently in our class for feedback, for more thoughts on their own papers, and we cited them. And so all of that is really important to you as a unit because then you're getting different perspectives, right? You're the ones who have seen the testimony like for 300 times or 400 times. But these professors never seen it before. And so they will offer a fresh new perspective. Secondly, your feedback must be constructive because, you know, you don't want feedback that's just like, yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was bad. Ask for like constructive criticism. Next slide.
Ernest, I'll just jump in and say that, and part of the people that you can get feedback from, you can get feedback from us for sure. And please use us as a resource. You'll be joining our Discord, so you'll be able to ask questions, and any volunteer who's available is happy to help.
Oh, yes, and that leads to the very next slide, which is uh basically maybe it was the next one. Yeah, it was this one. Use your resources. Thank you, Ria. We are a resource, right? Alumni, people who have been through the program, your teachers who have led previous groups of students. They're a resource. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't vanish off the face of the earth. And also, if you have like presentation anxiety, especially for like competitions, this is some good practice for that inevitable competition that you're going to be attending to in a few months. And so, yeah, it's oh, next slide. Oh, could we go to the next slide? Okay. Tip number 6, solutions are key and they're most important, right? Some there's like this phrase that I put up here. Good teams can identify problems, great teams will identify solutions. It's very important because not only is it part of the rubric that you guys were shown last week or 2 weeks ago, it's also it's also a natural leading question from identifying the problem. So, for example, you've identified if you're unit 4 or unit 3, I think it was unit 3, you've identified that, for example, the electoral college might need to be revamped. That's identifying the problem. But how will you identify the solution? How do we fix the electoral college, for example? That's a solution. You're going to have to flesh that out. And it's really important because you sound more research, you sound more coherent and sound more well educated on the issue than simply a unit who just knows that there's a problem that exists. So yes, identify a reasonable alternative. Next slide. Tip number 7, play the devil's advocate, or better, i.e., consider all the positions of the argument. So what's a devil's advocate? It's just arguing for the other side of the argument. So, for example, as a Unit 5, I might say that, like, okay, I don't like Supreme Court justice term limits for whatever reason. Then play devil's advocate, right? Like, be like, hey, I like the fact that Supreme Court justices get, life tenure, and then consider the arguments for that position. That way, not only are you practicing how to disagree with your teammates, as we said, that's really important. You're also getting a better understanding of your own argument because as you consider arguments that might attack your own position, you gain a better understanding and how to defend against those arguments.
And before we move on, thanks, Ernest. I just wanted to add something on this point, and I think we talked about this the last summer session, and we'll keep talking about it throughout the year. But it's really important that you don't feel the need to lie about your position. You don't have to take on a position just because you need to show the other side. What you can do in circumstances where if no one on your unit thinks that they agree with the other side, you can still set out the other side by saying, some people argue, or better yet, picking actual proponent of that argument, displaying that side of the argument, and then you can talk about why you think that ultimately doesn't carry the day. That's going to get you the same amount of points if you just had somebody else on your unit show the other side. So consider doing that if everyone agrees otherwise, and you'll still get the points.
Yeah, so wording there would be like people who oppose this might say, or people who are against this would say blah 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 blah, blah. And then you would say whatever position that is. So yeah, you don't always have to truly disagree, but you always want to present the side of the people who disagree. Let's go to the next tip. Yeah, this one is really important. You really want to work with other units. Many units, they just stay in their own little like unit one, unit five bubble. They never consider, other how other units might help. We have this concept of sister units, right? Like we typically group what units one and two together, three and four, and five and six together. But you should consider all other units and talk to them and work with them throughout your testimony. And this could be like practicing the Q&A period with them as we did. We called them hot seat parties, but it was literally a session where we would gather together and you would ask each other follow-up questions about our testimony from the perspective of a different unit. And yeah, but I here have this picture of yes, listen to what Joshua Dye just said. I put this picture of these, Marines in boot camp lifting up a log because it really gives, the sense of teamwork. You all have to contribute the same amount in order to kind of lift this log, right? Or in order to deliver um, a well-written testimony and also answer follow-up questions really well. And this only happens when you work with people outside of your unit as well as inside your unit.
There are lots of good synergies. Sabrina also added in the chat that 1 and 6, 2 and 4, and 3 and 5 pair well.
Oh, yes. Okay, on to the final tip. Spend time with your people, your unit people, your people, as you might say. Not just with your unit, but with the entire team. I mean, here you can see some instances of my year where we spent time outside of practice, playing board games, hanging out at parties, climbing a tree for some reason. Um, that's really important because it brings a sense of camaraderie and also you feel more, connected to your people. Like, it's typically, it's a very sad thing to see a unit not be friends with each other. And so spend time with them, get to know them, get to know how they operate, get to know them as a person. That's all important because also it's going to help you in competition too, because then you know how they might answer a hot seat question. You might know when they'll jump in, and all that will help you in competition. So thank you guys all for listening. That's the end of this presentation. Do any of you guys have questions?
Seeing none. Thanks so much, Ernest. Really appreciate your presentation on that. Go ahead. Sean, did you have something to add?
Nope, I'm just getting ready for the next part.
Excellent. All right. So our final sort of section for today is going to be going into breakout rooms. Like we did last time, there'll be a CACE volunteer kind of there to facilitate the conversation. When we go into the breakout rooms, I strongly encourage that you turn on your camera and that you participate actively. I do provide your teachers with information about how the summer sessions went and a list of everyone who participated. So I really encourage you all to be involved and engaged as we do this. The breakout room discussion we will be having is what is the most important duty of citizenship and what is the least important duty of citizenship and why? So you'll all discuss both of those options. We're going to come back to the main room and then we're going to vote for each of these. So I'm going to ask everyone to bring back a few of the ideas that were discussed. You'll tell me, I'll put the entries that you tell me about in a poll and then we'll vote and decide once and for all what's the most important and what's the least important. And people often forget to talk about the least important, so I please do that one as well. I know the most important can take up a large part of the conversation. It is 12:26 right now, so we're gonna have you all summoned back to the main room at 12:50. So you have a decent chunk of time to discuss and we'll see you then. And you should be auto assigned to a room, but if you have trouble getting into the room, hang around and I can help direct you to the correct room. See you all in a bit. And I'll note that the breakout rooms will not be recorded.
Being fed by mom and dad, probably on the top of the mind.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for participating in the room. So now I'm going to be crafting this poll live while you all give me answers for the most important and the least important. And when you give an answer, you have to explain why. I have a preference for you turning on your camera and explaining, but if you must, you can type it in the chat. I'm hoping somebody, maybe Katie, can sort of lead this discussion so I can focus on taking notes and adding to the poll as we go. And you are on mute, Katie.
Thank you so much. Wow. Okay, we had 6 total breakout rooms. Okay, so I was in breakout room number 1. Does someone in breakout room number 1 want to share what y'all came up with and your why?
Here, I can share.
Thank you, Travis.
Yeah, we talked about how voting and staying informed about politicians and like not having unbiased news sources when you're looking at like politicians' policies and stuff is really important because one thing we talked about is like obeying the law and how sometimes there are certain laws that maybe we don't agree with and it's like should we follow those laws? But then if you vote for your representatives and your senators, then those are the people that are making the laws. So I think at the end of the day, our consensus as a breakout room was that voting kind of reaches all parts of our duties, and so that's why we said voting is the most important.
And then the least important.
Oh, for the least important, we said jury duty. And honestly, it was a pretty hard thing to come up with because we thought that all of the responsibilities are like all of our responsibilities as citizens are important. But when we like looked at our list, we just thought that jury duty was the least important of the ones we have. But at the end of the day, I think what we came up with is that it is important that you follow all of your duties since they all have significance and that's why they are duties that we have.
Oh, all right. Can someone from breakout room number 2, those are the folks that were with Sean, can someone share what you came up with as a room?
Yeah. So in our room, we were talking about, we did a lot of emphasis on the First Amendment. So I think for our most important rights, we were talking about the freedom to protest, right to assemble, and also the freedom of speech, obviously. It wasn't that much, we weren't, like as set on, I guess, voting as our most important right, mainly because we decided that protesting and civil disobedience would be a greater way to express our opinions as citizens. And for our least important rights, we first talked about the Third Amendment mainly because it's not used that much in the modern day context. And then we also someone touched on it again, jury duty in our group, and also selective service, like mandatory registration for selective service.
Okay. Someone from room number 3, those are folks that were with Joshua.
Yeah, so
And
we
Harsha.
kind of, sorry,
Go
we
for
kind
it.
of agreed that like voting was the most important. I think the thing that we had the most confusion on, or not confusion, the most debate on, was what was the least important. There were different things that we talked about. We kind of talked about how um, like as different duties, the ones that are brought up the most, that we talk about the most and we think of the most, um, are usually not the least important. And the ones that, we haven't used in a while, like let's think about, well, I think the example I brought up was like the selective service. We haven't used that since the Vietnam War, and it only applies to certain people, just hasn't really been thought of recently. And I think Harsha brought up like quartering soldiers. Oh, that's probably that hasn't happened for a hot minute, and I don't think that's something that we think about too much. So I think that yeah, those are kind of the least important in that range. But I think we kind of, as a group, we came to a consensus that voting was the most important.
All right. Someone from room number 4. I don't see clearly a case name on the. Oh, with Sabrina. If you were Sabrina in room number 4.
I can go.
Thank you.
So I was in room number 4, and I think our room was also pretty similar on agreement with how the other rooms were talking about voting as the most important civil duty. Um, I think my best friend Gray and Paxton were talking about that, and um, I kind of like didn't understand the question at the start, so I was thinking of how rather than portraying civil duties as like most important or least important on like a spectrum, we could rather see them of how each of the duties and each of the rights are kind of like privileges that we have, such as the privilege of us to vote because we didn't have that in the past for everyone, or the privilege of us to have news every day about the current events in our society because we didn't have that in the past. And I think it was more for me to rather like think of how each of these duties and each of these rights that we have evolved and have changed to become more accessible, to become more frequent for us to have during this time.
Hey, thank you. Someone from room number 5. Those are folks that are with Rashab.
Hi, I
I
can
can
go.
go. Oh,
Oh, okay.
you can go.
Okay. So what we decided on as or like what we came up with was the right to vote was one of them or what was the most important because like as we said, if you don't vote on things, then like your opinion, like it won't really get out and like and what if in a democracy like we need the opinions to be out. So I think that's why we thought the right to vote was important.
And so some of the important civic duties we thought a lot of civic duties were important and they all served a function, but some of the least were filing taxes because this was brought up by Layla. It was like a repetitive and redundant part of government. And then also displaying the flag and knowing the Pledge of Allegiance were among the least important that we thought.
Interesting.
I'd
And
also like to add,
yeah,
sorry, could I add something real quick?
yeah, go for it.
We talked about voting a little bit, but I think that most of our discussion was talking about jury duty. We actually disagree with a lot of the other breakout rooms because um, for jury duty, like it's really easy to get out of and really easy to complain about because it takes a lot of time, um, and it can be very boring. But you're actively participating in the decision of the future of one of your peers or multiple peers, and is not something that you should skip out on or take lightly because it. I think Rashad mentioned it could be the difference between life and death for someone.
All right. And then lastly, someone from room 6. And I love the way that y'all jumped in and kind of built off of each other. That's a great example of the kinds of like skills and conversations you'll be doing this year. Yeah. Room 6 with Ria.
I can go. I'm actually a fierce advocate of jury duty. I think it's among one of our most important civic duties. And the reason I say that is because I feel like what makes a duty of citizenship important is how much it affects the livelihoods, the day-to-day, like the ease of day-to-day life between the citizens. So I feel like with jury duty, like, you're not often just going to be tied to like a murder case that happened a couple cities away. You're not going to be tied to like a DUI case, but it's how you contribute to the verdict in that case and how like the perspective that you contribute, it ultimately is going to affect how the court and how that like government says how that judicial system over there affects how they try cases that will ultimately affect you. Like you will like everyone is tied to the justice system, and even though like if some cases might seem like a stretch, like how the court rules on that is going to affect how they rule on a case that might be relevant to you. And I feel like jury duty, like you provide when you get called up, you provide a perspective of a person that's just like you somewhere else. And I think that's insanely valuable because ultimately that person who's just like you might find themselves in a position where they need to rely on the judicial system like that. Yeah.
Did we have a least important from room 6?
Our room struggled with that.
That's okay.
They thought it was all important, which was really fun, honestly.
It sounds like there was a lot of great conversations that happened. Thank you so much, everyone, for reporting back on that. I really appreciate it. I think that kind of helps round out our poll for Sabrina.
Yes, so I'm gonna read out loud the options before I publish them, just so everyone knows. And for those listening at home on YouTube later, they can see what they missed in this fun voting. So I actually put all of the rights we discussed and duplicated the poll for least. So anyone can select any of the options we discussed, whether or not it was for or against. So all of the duties that will be discussed are voting. I put protest, assembly, and speech together, staying informed slash educated, direct participation in government, whether it's holding office, volunteering, working for government, paying taxes, following the laws, jury duty, selective service slash military service, quartering soldiers, patriotism slash country loyalty slash pride, and community service. So I'm launching the poll imminently, and it should all pop up on your screens. I'm hoping all 36 of you will participate. The hosts are not allowed to participate, so it'll just be the students.
Why not? Why shouldn't we vote for most important civic duties?
We're the unelected officials, Sean.
Yeah.
It's true.
I'm physically not able to vote, so
Yeah, we've been barred from participation. We'll have to work on CACE
disenfranchisement.
suffrage.
Yeah, if I could control it, I would, but I cannot.
Yeah, we'd have to unco-host everyone, and that's
That's
just
fine.
It's okay. Now you get a feeling of the other side as a white property holding male. You get
Yeah,
to see the other side.
you make a good point. I am fortunate to finally own property in my 40s.
Congratulations.
Thank
Two
you.
more people that need to vote. One more. Okay, we have 100% participation. So I am ending the poll now. It should pop up on your screen when I share the results, but in case it doesn't appear on the screen recording, the final results are as follows. The most important civic duty is voting, which got 50% of the vote. In second place was protest, assembly, and speech, which had 19% of the vote, and 17% was staying informed and educated. Now, the least important civic duty was, drumroll, 36% at quartering soldiers. And then in a tie for second place for least important civic duty is selective service slash military service and patriotism slash country loyalty slash pride. So thank you all for participating in this lively discussion. I really appreciated everyone's contributions and thoughtfulness throughout. And this has been great, and we look forward to seeing you for the next summer session, which will be in, I believe, 2 weeks, but you'll get an email from me. I will also send your teacher all the materials. As always, we have recorded this session. I will upload it to YouTube as soon as possible so you can refer back to it later or send to your classmates that never had a chance to participate in the program live. You all should have a link to all the materials for the summer session as well. It was in the agenda I sent around, but if you ever need to find something that we talked about during the summer sessions, feel free to email me at sabrina@caciviceducation.org. My email is all over our website as well. I will say we are in the process of updating and adding some resources to our evidence sources document. And so once we have updated it and added some more materials there, I will update both our caciviceducation.org website as well as send the new Word document around to your teachers and all teachers so that they can share that with you as you go through the program. Any questions for me or for the team before we log off for the day? All right, hearing none, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Bye.
It's going to be a fun year.